So now we're moving on to liberalism. Now one can argue liberalism is a disputatious set of doctrines. And there is so much to say with regards to the history, to the philosophy, to the foundation of liberalism. But I think we have to be practical. And when we talk about liberalism, essentially what we are saying is the primacy of the individual. The academic Charles Taylor, he argues that liberalism gives priority to the individual. The academic Marilyn Friedman argues that this assumes individualism to a certain degree. That liberalism is based on individualism because you're giving priority to the individual, primacy to the individual. I know there's academic discussions on this issue, but let's be practical. And individualism is, according to Marilyn Friedman, an approach to the individual, an approach to the self, an approach to the human being that sees the human being as an abstract entity devoid of social obligations and attachments. This is why, my dear brothers and sisters, when you have the so-called Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have to understand that it is not universal. It is actually a liberalized conception of human rights. But they want to play the game and assume that it's absolute and universal. Don't get me wrong. We believe in individual rights as well, within the framework of the Quran and the Sunnah. For example, we have this notion of huquq al-ibad, the rights of the servants, the rights of the individuals. But that is understood through the lenses of divine commands, not through the lenses of the primacy of the individual, or through the lenses of individualism, or through the lenses of liberalism. We may even agree with some of the human rights as per the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we may not agree with the priority, how they're prioritized. We may add other ones in there too. And we won't agree with their conception and manifestation and application because they are applied from a secular perspective, an individualistic perspective, giving primacy to the individual. And the way to deal with liberalism essentially is to attack its foundation, its basis. And its basis is giving primacy to just the individual. And we would argue this is complete and utter nonsense, utter bakwas. It's bakwas on stilts, bakwas on Burj Khalifa. And the reason being, because think about it ontologically, think about it from the perspective of how we came into existence and how we're developed as human beings. Individualism doesn't make any sense at all. Because no one was born, no one emerged from the wombs of their mothers with a briefcase and a tie and a bank balance and intellect and health. There was a process of nurturing. You were born, most of us, in a hospital. You were dependent on the hospital, the midwife, the doctors, the system, your mother, your father, the social apparatus in place to facilitate your birth. You were dependent on almost an infinite number of variables outside of your control in order for you to be here today. Also, the way you develop language and the way you learn at school is through social relations and social interactions. So it's very important to understand that individualism doesn't really make sense, because if we give primacy and priority to just the individual, then it doesn't really make sense with regards to how we are developed as human beings, because there is an emphasis, there is a necessary need for social hierarchies, for social connections and social relationships. And we have necessary dependencies on things that's outside of our individual control. So that's a very important starting point, to start to see that individualism kind of doesn't really make sense. And also we understand this through understanding society itself, how social norms are developed, how social pressure is developed. Individuals are not desert islands. The individual impacts society, and society impacts the individual. And we know this from Islam. The famous hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he talks about the limits of Allah, or the hudud of Allah. And he says that those who try to defend or protect the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are like those people on a boat. There is an upper deck and a lower deck. And the upper deck is giving fresh water to the lower deck. And when they stop giving water, or if they stop giving water to the lower deck, what does the lower deck do? They dig a hole and the whole ship drowns. This is a beautiful, beautiful hadith. It teaches us so many different things about the nature of individuals and the nature of society. And it shows that we are part of a mechanism, a complementary system. That yes, the boat is made up of individuals, but there is a connection between these group of individuals that is required and is necessary for the functioning of the boat. And there's so many more lessons, but this hadith really indicates that we're not individualists, if you like. We don't adopt the false philosophical premise of individualism, that we're just abstract entities devoid from social obligations and attachments. That's not just the primacy of the individual. And we see this with the hudud of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We see this with the Sharia. We see this with the Islamic law. We see this with the penal code and the punishments. We see that these punishments don't just focus on the individual, they focus on the well-being of society. Because many of these suitably harsh punishments are there as a prevention, as preventative measures. Because in a liberal society, because of the primacy of the individual, they focus on, it's very harsh on that individual. Because they just see it through the lens of prioritizing the individual. But we don't see it through the lens of the individual. We see it through a holistic lens of understanding society impacts the individual and the individual impacts society. So our laws are understood through that perspective. You can't understand the laws from an individualistic perspective. Let me give you an example in inheritance laws. And this will do with some of the feminists in the room as well. I'm talking about the brothers. So, in inheritance law, when a father passes away and he has a son and a daughter, the daughter will get half of what the son has. Many feminists and liberals will say, you people oppress women, you think they're lesser value. Because what are they doing now? Yes, they have the false premise of feminism, which argues that any form of male hierarchy is a source of oppression, which is complete nonsense, and it's kufr really. They have that notion, but also from a liberal perspective, they're seeing the individual. They're not even seeing it from a gender perspective or social obligation perspective or social model perspective. The primacy is on that individual. Why are you being unfair on that individual? Because their lens or the microscope or the magnifying glass is on that individual, not on the holistic understanding of social relations and obligations and attachments. Is this clear? So they will say there's a problem. And we say, well, no, you're framing it incorrectly. You're framing it through the perspective of either feminism or liberal feminism or just liberalism by focusing on the individual. We reject your premise. And if you understand Islam from a communitarian holistic perspective, you would see that in Islamic jurisprudence, when it comes to inheritance, is based on two main principles. Principle number one, the closeness to the deceased. Principle number two, your social obligations and attachments. So we don't have a liberal notion, an individualistic notion. So when you see it from this perspective, it makes sense. Because when the father passes away, whatever the woman gets is all hers, and there is no right upon her to give it to anybody. But when the son takes the inheritance, he has to take care of his women folk, which now includes his own sister. Food, shelter, clothing. If she's unmarried, of course. And in Islamic law, if he doesn't fulfill that obligation, he could be reprimanded, or the state intervenes and takes care of her. Because one of the objectives of the Islamic polity is to ensure the economic emancipation of women, that they're taken care of. They're honored. Women are honored. So when you see it from that non-individualistic perspective, a non-liberal perspective, a holistic perspective, a complementarian perspective, a communitarian perspective, an Islamic perspective of reality, understanding that society is made up of individuals and they affect society and society affects individuals, you will see how amazing this law is, because it's not about that it's because she's a woman or there's something wrong with that individual. It's because of her roles and responsibilities. They're both closer to the deceased, but each one has different social roles and responsibilities. That's why you have a different amount of inheritance. And also, if you study jurisprudence, you realize in 16 cases, women get more than men. In around 16 cases. In around 4 cases, they get the same. Because it's not about there's something wrong with that particular individual. You see it holistically. It's about closeness to the deceased and roles and responsibilities in the Islamic social and economic system. So do you see, even with this example, you show how the liberal outlook, the individualistic outlook is false. And you have to be able to smell it and unpack what they're trying to do here. They have a wrong premise. They focus on the primacy of the individual. They don't see the individual as having social obligations or attachments, or necessary social obligations and attachments. But we see things far more holistically. Now they may argue, well, we disagree that there should be roles and responsibilities for male and female in particular context. Well, we just say, so what? You're wrong, we're right, because it comes from Allah. And that's a different argument which we could talk about another time. But do you understand now how individualism shapes the ideology, and the primacy of the individual shapes the ideology? And if you think about it, liberalism is quite secular in nature. It doesn't believe in God, that we owe duties to God or we have responsibilities to Allah. Also, liberalism has this understanding of not, especially from a political liberal perspective, not propagating a conception of the good life. A conception of the good life basically means that you are saying that this is how you should live your life. These are moral values. Generally speaking, political liberalism must keep a principle distance. And there should be now a vacuum, a moral vacuum, if you like, where individuals enter and they could discuss and use their rational faculties to actually find out how they should live their lives. We totally disagree with that perspective. We believe, no, there is a conception of the good life. There are certain values that must be propagated in society. There is a moral code. There is a political, social, individual moral code that people should live by. There are some standards. It's not this principle distance. It's not this vacuum of moral values that individuals now just decide from themselves. Because they have the primaries of the individual, they believe the individual is inherently rational and they will make their own decision about how they should live their own individual lives. Again, this is complete nonsense. Complete bakwas. Because when you look at the nature of society, human beings are sheep. And you see this anthropologically. You see this from a social perspective. When there are powerful structures in society, they're going to make you think what they want you to think. They're going to make you believe what they want you to believe. They're going to make you believe what is right in terms of what they believe is right. And we see this. We see how these narratives play out. And we see this anthropologically and historically and throughout different nations and epochs and eras of time. To just assume that an individual is he takes primacy or she takes priority, and she's using her rational faculties to understand what is right and wrong on her own, ignores the social fact that we get influenced by society and social norms, and we get influenced by powerful structures in society, and we get influenced by these things to the degree that sometimes we give up our own rationality because we're human beings, that we require certainty and we have a need to belong. In social psychology, they discuss this. It's called informational social influence or normative social influence. Informational social influence is, I have a need to feel certain. If I can't get that certainty from myself or from my immediate group, I'm going to go to the dominant frame. That's why some Muslims become liberals and feminists. Because they feel uncertain, they can't answer questions within the community for some reason. And their dominant group at university or their peers is secular and feminist or liberal. So they're going to submit to that dominant frame. It's a psychological issue. I want to feel certain. I can't get it from myself or from my immediate group. I'm going to go to the dominant group or the dominant frame. Normative social influences, I have a need to belong. Human beings have a need to belong. If I can't find that belonging from my immediate group, I'm going to go to the dominant frame. And if the dominant frame happens to be liberal or secular, I'm going to attach myself to them even if I disagree with them, because we have a need to belong. So this idea of there's a vacuum of moral values and individuals using their own rational faculties are going to debate and discuss amongst themselves is complete nonsense, because it ignores the anthropological, social, historical, and political fact that you're influenced by other people, other groups, other powerful structures in society. So Islam actually propagates moral values, certain moral values in society. It's not just a principle distance from a political perspective and a social perspective. So the point here is, understand that liberalism is based on individualism, or as some thinkers call atomism. They atomize the individual. And there's a history about this. There is a history. The history is that you had in Europe, it's a very Eurocentric issue, by the way. And they're trying to assume that it is universal now. They took a European problem and they reacted to that problem, and now they're exporting it all around the world thinking it's universal. This is like a form of metaphysical narcissism. They're narcissistic ideologically. They're projecting themselves on the whole world. Liberalism is good for us. Individualism is good for us. Therefore, it's good for every single one. In actual fact, it's not good for you, because social fragmentation and decay is increasing. And even in 2004, the Children's Society report that was published in the UK argued that there's more social fragmentation and decay in the UK, and I think they cited America as well. And I think on page 4 they said it's because of excessive individualism. So it came from a particular historical context. The Catholic Church would use the coercive arm of the state to prevent any thinking that was against its doctrine. Then you had the Protestant Reformation, you had issues with trade, laws or rights. Then you had the religious wars, the 80-year wars, the 30-year wars, the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day, and so on and so forth. And as Professor John Sharvey in his book, The Liberal Project and Human Rights, he basically argues in his introduction that this facilitated the birth of liberalism, that thinkers had to see the human being as abstracted away from God's will and to individualize them. And this was a problem for Europe, and that's how they reacted to that problem. It was a forced reaction, but they reacted to it in this way by developing an individualistic doctrine which became basically the basis for liberalism, and now they think is universal for everybody. It's not universal because it came from a specific problem, and also individualism itself is eating the society. It's destroying the society, even from a moral perspective, intuitively and otherwise. In the UK, we have glorified concentration camps. We take our parents when they're a bit old and we put them in the glorified concentration camps. That's what they are, brothers and sisters. Is this what we want for Pakistan? For our mothers and our fathers? Now because they're going against the individualistic doctrine about it's all about me, primacy to the individual. I want to live my life. I want to be happy. I want to have well-being. I don't want to have social obligations and attachments to my parents. I don't need them anymore. They're non-functioning, so I'm going to send them to glorified concentration camps. Is this what we want for Pakistan? Well, this is what liberalism is about. At the end of the day, practically and functionally, we don't want to send our parents to concentration camps. This is why abortion is not a problem for them. It's true. Because babies are a burden. I have to take care of them. Just like their parents now become a burden. And it's based on this secular, godless, individualistic understanding of reality. So realize, when they attack the Sharia, or they attack Islam, or they have certain perspectives, understand it's coming from an individualistic doctrine, a liberal doctrine. They're emphasizing on the individual. They're not seeing the holistic picture that society impacts the individual, individuals impact society. There are social obligations and attachments, not only to others, but to society and to Allah. Once you realize this basic point, you could smell liberalism from a mile away. You'll be able to smell it and understand, okay, this person's being a liberal here. So moving on from this, I just want to quickly discuss secular and liberal ethics. Now, generally speaking, one would argue liberalism is not really about ethics. It's more about rights, because it's about the primacy of the individual rights. And from this perspective, we could say, well, we disagree with your notion of rights, because who has the right to give you your rights? The human mind or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Allah. So we could easily discuss with them. So that's why when they say, oh, individual rights, don't think this is universal and absolute. They're throwing this trap, the isms trap, to try and catch you. It's a rhetorical trap to make you feel bad. Say, no, we believe in rights, but the conception of rights through the understanding of Allah and His Messenger, not through your own understanding. Because who has the right to give you your rights? You or Allah? It's as simple as that. And because the primacy is on the individual, what they do is they focus on almost the hedonistic principle. Because if you look at the works of liberal thinkers and philosophers, Mill, and others, you see, generally speaking, they focused a lot on individual well-being and happiness. And they focus a lot on the hedonistic principle. I'm just here to be happy. And what is happiness? Fulfilling my desires. What does Allah say about this though? Have you not seen the one who takes his own desire as his Lord? Liberalism is really almost a form of shirk, that it deifies your desires, because the fulfilling of desires is what they say is well-being and happiness, the hedonistic principle. We fundamentally reject this. And don't let them try and trap you, because they trap you from the perspective of you try to identify yourself with your desires. We reject this completely, because Allah says that our main identity is being servants to Allah. We submit to Allah. We worship Allah. We humbly adore Allah. We don't refer to our desires. Desires in and of themselves are not blameworthy, as long as they are manifested and expressed through the moral guidelines of Islam. They're blameworthy if you express them that go against the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we don't identify ourselves with shahawat, with blameworthy desires. We identify ourselves as servants to Allah. But a liberal doctrine that's based on the primacy of the individual, which is based on the hedonistic principle that the individual should be happy, and the way the individual is happy is by fulfilling their desires, that perspective is totally false from an Islamic perspective. And don't let them trap you to get you to think, don't you want to be happy? Don't you want other people to be happy? There is an individualistic assumption here which is based on the hedonistic principle that what makes you happy is following your blameworthy desires. But as you know, from a spiritual, existential, and psychological perspective, if you always follow your desires, you're going to be very unhappy. You're going to be very unhappy. If you forget Allah, Allah will make you forget your own self. Those who neglect the remembrance of Allah, they would have a depressed life. We are the most connected human beings on the planet. Social media, everyone has internet, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, this, that, and the other. And in the UK, loneliness is a pandemic. They had to hire a minister on loneliness because of this excessive individualism, this excessive pursuing of the hedonistic principle that my happiness is contingent on me fulfilling my blameworthy desires. Reducing the human being to just shahawat, to just blameworthy desires. Animals, really, animals. So moving on from this, now let's talk about secular liberal ethics. Although I did say liberalism, generally speaking, is about rights and the hedonistic principle, but it implies certain normative ethical theories. And in a liberal secular paradigm, we have certain ethical theories. And I just want to talk about two: deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics. What does consequentialist ethics mean? Consequentialist ethics means that they look at the consequences of an action to determine whether an action is good or bad. It's in the term, consequentialism. You look at the consequences of an action. And there are two broad ethical theories under consequentialism: utilitarianism and ethical egoism. Utilitarianism and ethical egoism. What is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism says that the rightness or wrongness of a particular action is based upon whether it increases the happiness or well-being for the greatest number of people, or whether it decreases the suffering or ill-being for the greatest number of people. Is this clear? So it's based upon the greatest number of people, increasing the well-being or decreasing their ill-being for the greatest number of people. That is what is good. Obviously, we could challenge this by saying, what do you mean by well-being? What is ill-being? How do you know the consequences? what is your calculus, if you like, your rational criteria to understand what is a negative consequence or a positive consequence from a consequentialist perspective, from a utilitarian perspective. We could challenge all of these things. Ethical egoism is different from psychological egoism. Ethical egoism says that you ought to pursue what is in line with your self-interest. Ego, Greek word, ego, me, I. You ought to pursue what's in your self-interest. Psychological egoism is that human beings always they naturally pursue what's in their self-interest. Those are two different things. So ethical egoism is an ethical normative theory that doesn't talk about the maximum number of people now. It says as long as it is in line with my interest, then that is what is good. So in liberal society, generally speaking, they're consequentialist, in particular utilitarian, but there are some ethical egoism in there as well. But you also have deontological ethics. Deontological ethics is about duties. It doesn't really focus on the consequences of a moral action. It says, let's develop some rational criteria. And there are different forms of deontological ethics, but you don't have to really know them. But in principle, they basically argue that we should formulate some rational criteria to find out what are our moral duties. What are moral duties? And you had the likes of Immanuel Kant, who developed the categorical imperative and so on and so forth, but we don't have to get into that. Just think of it on a basic conceptual perspective. That you use your rational mind to formulate criteria to assess what our moral duties are. And it's not about the consequences. An example is the transatlantic slave trade. From a utilitarian perspective, from a consequentialist perspective, it was morally good. That's why in secular liberal ethics, they combine both. From a utilitarian perspective, it was morally good because you have a minority of Africans coming from Africa that they've enslaved, and their enslavement increases the well-being for American society. Financially, and so on and so forth. So from a utilitarian perspective, it's not an issue. Because it's about the maximum number of people. So the increasing of well-being for the maximum number of people, even if an enslaved minority have to suffer. So deontological ethics says, we don't care about the consequences. It's wrong because we are duty-bound not to enslave people because of the color of their skin. We're duty-bound not to enslave people irrespective of the consequences. Is this clear? That's why there's a combination of both. So how would Islam argue against these liberal or secular ethics? Number one, and write this down. These normative ethical theories are what you call rational ethical theories. In other words, they rely on the human mind as a basis for moral laws, for morality, for ethics. What does Islam rely on for morals and ethics? Is it fundamentally the aql, or is it Allah and His Messenger? Don't get me wrong, there is a role of the aql, of course, because you have to use the aql, the intellect, to assess the divine commands of Allah. And in certain areas where there are no explicit divine commands, we can use our aql based on moral principles from the Quran and Sunnah to outweigh the maslahah and mafsada, the harm and the benefit. And this is part of the Islamic legal moral thinking. So there is a role of the aql, but it's not a foundation for morals and ethics. It's a tool to understand morals and ethics. Is this clear? So that's the first point. And we would say it makes more sense because who is Allah? Bring it back to Tawheed. Allah can make the universal moral claim. Allah is Al-Alim, Al-Hakim. He has the moral picture. We got the moral pixel. Because we know what is halal is good for us, what is haram is bad for us in general. So Allah only knows the true consequences of a particular moral action, not us. We have a limited, pixelated understanding of reality. Allah has the moral picture, we've got the moral pixel. Allah is Al-Bar, He is the source of all goodness, He's the greatest benefactor. Allah knows and we don't. So by virtue of who Allah is, because of who Allah is, we know that when we refer to Allah, it is the best thing from a moral perspective and even from a consequentialist perspective. Now, another thing to argue is consequentialism, seeing the consequences of an action, is very limited and secular because they do not have the akhirah in the equation. Why should I adopt your secular assumption? Once you put the akhirah in the equation, the consequences totally change. Because if you do zina, you're going to go to hell, then with all due respect, by virtue of even a consequentialist theory, zina is wrong. Because the consequences are eternal damnation. Do you see the point? I'm only saying this to show you that they have a metaphysical bias, meaning they have a view of the world that is not in line with our view because it's secular and doesn't include the akhirah. Is this clear? So that's the main point. They refer to the human mind as a foundation. We refer to Allah and His Messenger, which transcend the human mind. But we can also use the human mind as a tool to understand the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The other thing to ask is this. Who is to decide what these moral duties are? So from a deontological perspective, we said they formulate rational criteria to understand what are moral values and moral duties. What are these moral duties? But according to whose conception? Whose criteria? How do you prioritize them? And we would say it's not the human mind, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we discuss why that's the case. From a consequentialist and utilitarian perspective, we would argue, what objective proof do you have to prove the objectivity of the so-called truth that what is moral is what increases the well-being for the greatest number of people? Why should we follow that principle? On what basis? And how do you find well-being? Is it just fulfilling your desires? How do you define well-being? How do you define happiness? And how do you assess the consequences of a particular action? Do you know the full consequences, or does Allah know the full consequences? So why should we adopt your theory? On what basis? Challenge them back. Don't assume their paradigm. Don't assume the liberal secular paradigm. Turn the tables. And you would say, well, you have that position because you believe most likely that what is good is based on the consequences of a particular action, whether it increases the well-being for the maximum number of people. We don't follow that view. We're divine command theorists. Why should I adopt your view? Why are you assuming this is universal? Why are you assuming this is absolute? And you discuss with them why they should believe in Allah and His Messenger and why they should submit to His commands. And you refer back to Tawheed like we just did. Does this make sense so far? Now what they would bring to the table is you threefold dilemma, but we already addressed it in the first session. So, this is the way on how to deal with liberalism. Understand that liberalism has an assumption, a philosophical premise called atomism or individualism, which sees the human being as an abstract entity devoid from social obligations and attachments, and the primacy is on the individual. And in that implies the hedonistic principle that we should just pursue what makes us happy, and what makes us happy is the fulfillment of our desires, but we don't identify with blameworthy desires. And we challenge the notion that what makes you happy is fulfilling your desires. And we also gave some examples in Islamic jurisprudence concerning inheritance and even the hudud to understand that we have a communitarian, holistic approach, that it's not just an individualistic perspective, that we understand the individual impacts society and society impacts the individual, and we see things from more of a complementarian, a communitarian and holistic perspective. So we don't adopt that particular view. And even the conception of rights is seen from an individualistic doctrine. And we reject that premise and that notion. And we also reject the ethical implications like utilitarianism and deontological ethics. We say the human mind is not the foundation for ethics, it's Allah and His Messenger, and we explain why that's more coherent. And we will challenge utilitarianism and deontological ethics by raising certain key questions like who decides? What is happiness? How do you know this is the complete consequences? Why haven't you included the akhirah? Why do you have a metaphysical, secular, atheistic bias? And these are very important conceptual tools that you could use in unpacking these issues.